The Honeymooners, a short story series by Unwitting Conspirators. Tim was cold. He'd run through the rain for over 20 minutes on what was supposed to be a quick little outing to gather supplies. It was the first day of their celebratory trip, and here he was. He rolled his eyes, as a million little reasons she wasn't quite the luckiest woman alive, as she'd announced on Facebook to all of her friends, trickled in one by one, and then all at once. He swung the mostly empty gas can in his hand toward the bushes just out of his reach, and jammed the dripping wet fingers of his free hand into his loose front pocket. He fished around to find his phone, checking to see if he had connection again. Nothing. He needed to find some way to contact her before she left. After all, it would be rude of him to leave her hanging. Something Laura would never approve of. He held his phone over his head, as if the action might bring back the hot spot that had invited him to leave the campsite so hastily in the first place. Really, he was just living by her rule of treating every stranger with equal interest. It was only right. And it was only a coincidence that the stranger who'd approached him with such intensity also happened to be eye-catching for other reasons. By her standard, he had no choice but to be as helpful as possible. Tim picked up his pace again, sniffing an armpit to be sure he'd put on the right amount of deodorant to match the effort he was putting into this whole shenanigan. I'll tell you what, we'll make it a game. You said you're camping in these mountains? Well, I happen to be doing the same thing. And I also know these parts pretty well. The vision had laughed quietly before luring him deeper into the dimly lit hallway between the public restrooms. So later tonight, I'm gonna take a cruise. And when your phone vibrates telling you my hotspot is close by, you come find me. Like cat and mouse. Just two strangers. No one will ever have to know. An offer like that doesn't wait for anything long. Tim's thoughts nagged him as pictures drifted in, fishing dangerously close to a guilty excitement over the secrecy and playfulness of it all. Suddenly, he thought of Laura again, waiting patiently in the tent, probably playing some bejeweled game or reading something lame. A spark of paranoia ignited in the back of his mind. What if the rain washed the remnants of gasoline toward the tent opening? What if she smelled the evidence he'd left at the base of the tree, upstream from the tent, where he'd dumped it, after siphoning it from the tank and demanding they needed more wine, and that she deserved dark chocolates, only to find the car conveniently out of order. An act he knew would be a sure way to have her stay behind. Laura didn't like hiking. Or at least he was pretty sure she'd said that at one point in time. Either way, the plan had worked. He watched her eyes come to life through the memory as he rehashed it just to be sure everything was in order. She'd laughed sweetly and nodded along, but something in her eyes seemed different than usual on second glance. Anticipation, maybe? Tim shrugged it off, pulling out his phone. He pushed through his more equitable thoughts, falling in line with his usual fulfill the mission at all costs and never back down mentality. It had served him well in the military. He thought fondly back on those times. It suddenly felt like he was back in them again, doing something daring and beyond his comfort zone. His current enemy? Laura, the unwitting fiancée. He wiped the thought away, breaking into a run before realizing he was trying to find something specific, not to cover distance. He slowed down again. It was too late to think about what was already done. He'd either nail this or not. Either way, he was going to get nailed. He brought his phone screen to life and checked to see if he had any bars of service. Nothing. He opened the lock screen to the profile picture of the girl he'd met at the coffee shop that morning. She had a sweet, somehow familiar face, and her hair had been in a messy but neat bun, just the way he liked them. It was like she'd pinned him from across the room and decided, it's that one. And he'd loved it. A flash of lightning lit the sky, casting its shadow down to the ground to illuminate the forest around him. Timmy squinted into the distance. He could have sworn he'd seen something crossing the highway beneath the thick canopy looming in from either side, all around him. He stopped in his tracks, as if realizing for the first time how ridiculous the entire picture might look from above. Here he was, on a camping trip, with the woman he claimed to love waiting for him to refuel the gas tank he'd siphoned and dumped while she'd been taking care of personal business. And all in order to go through with a dastardly plan involving a literal stranger. And all under the guise of grabbing chocolates and wine, when he was the one planning on enjoying a sweet treat all on his own. Damn it. He crushed the thought with a fist full of gas can. She ruined everything lately. He reaffirmed the thought with his own. His heart picked up speed again as he pictured the mysterious smile that had caught his eye from the shadowed corner of the coffee shop. She'd held the stare all the way to the baked goods section he used as a reason to get a second helping of her adoring stare. Laura hadn't thought anything of his lingering, or so it had seemed, but that look she'd given him over the fire, before pulling out her phone to check the time, suggested just maybe. He shook the thought. Really, this was her fault. He pondered the idea, slowing his steps. She was the one who'd chosen this charming place. He never would have come here if not for this out-of-the-blue trip. So maybe the whole thing really was just a gift from the universe for doing the right thing and asking her to marry him in the first place. He smiled, emboldened at the idea of Kismet at work. Laura loved Kismet. A flash of lightning plastered the sky with its light, casting its shadow down to reflect through the branches and gathering darkness. The trees were getting thicker. Tim glanced around himself, appreciating the vastness outside of what his eyes were currently seeing. The gas station he'd last had service was no more than around another corner or two. He shivered as another shock of lightning stopped him in his tracks. He fumbled with his phone to engage the flashlight and pointed out in front of his feet. His eyes crawled toward the next bend, just as the next lightning flash came to pass. Another shadow was revealed, shifting strangely over the two-lane highway, surrounded on all sides by mountain forests. The little flashlight almost seemed to make things worse. Claustrophobia descended thick all around him. The idea of darkness acting as a shield for everything outside the small beam of light and basically working only to keep his eyes from adjusting, and with the combination of enough unknowns, all combined, the effect sent him soaring into action again. He nearly dropped his phone while disengaging the synthetic light. Tim blinked and rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, refusing to believe what he'd seen for a second time. He cussed again and again, blowing off anxious steam under each breath while weighing his options. When he looked down the winding road once more, he couldn't be sure through his readjusting eyes, but it almost looked as if the shadow figure were standing just outside of the bushes, watching him from across the 2-lane highway in the opposite direction. His breath caught. How would he explain being out in the dead of night and getting attacked by a bear or something? He hesitated. And what would happen when they came to the scene and started asking questions about the gasoline smell? He hesitated, then caught himself up again. Stop being such a wuss. He'd been a Marine, after all. What the hell was he afraid of? He lifted his boot and felt for the knife strapped at the base of his ankle. If it's a bear, I can climb a tree or outrage it. He imagined roaring in its face and making himself as big as he possibly could. It had worked in movies. He squinted into the distance. If push comes to shove, I can find some campsites nestled together and aim for them. Bears are antisocial, right? Everyone knows that. Suddenly he found himself wondering if anyone really did know that for certain. Or if that was just something book nerds said to seem smart and show their knowledge of something they'd never actually seen with their own eyes. Before he'd finished the thought, Tim found himself walking again, already convinced that he must have seen a wild animal, which would mean no cloak had actually been involved. It was simply his eyes playing tricks on him. The fanciful ideas pouring into his mind moved his feet forward one at a time, carrying him almost against his will, the same way they had on patrols. He smiled at the bittersweet memories, remembering those long nights. His imagination had lifted him away from a doomed show into a place where anything could happen. Same thoughts that had him and the guys laughing and passing while they shot the shit to stay alert more easily. Laura had answered his calls any time, day or night, unlike any of his family members. She'd really come through in a way most of the guys he knew envied. Tim slowed his steps again. They'd moved for his position in rank increase and active deployments so often it hadn't occurred to him until he started looking for rings that he hadn't really met any of her family. Just her stepmother once, who'd happened to be in Italy at the same time they had. Was that strange? He scratched his head. Tim had a close-knit family, for the most part. Another flash of lightning broke through the canopy and his thoughts, unleashing a new torrent of rain. The large drops slapped over the pavement loudly. He frowned through the invasive droplets. In fact, she'd never insisted he meet them after their first big fight. He slowed his feet. It seemed like forever ago. How had that even started? His mind wandered in the direction of the conversation. You promised this year we'd spend Christmas with my family, Tim. You know how important it was to me. Come on, Laura, don't do this. My mom gets worried about me. You know how my line of work is. It's never a guarantee.
Nothing is ever guaranteed with you, Timothy.
She'd said that right before walking away. She'd left to run errands or something. It had been at least 3 more Christmases since then, and she'd never said a word about spending the vacations we spent off base with my family. My loud brothers, the high standards offered openly by my sisters. And through it all, she'd just kind of fit right in, listening quietly like she always did. But she hadn't been so quiet lately, which was what had driven him to spend his bonus on a nice big ring in the first place. One that might impress a man he'd never met. Her father. He looked dead ahead, still walking slowly. He had no idea who her father really was. She'd mentioned he'd be proud to have another military man in the family, but that was about it. Suddenly, Timothy stopped again. What was he doing? The thought screamed a million different ways at him. All the ways he'd been outmatched in loyalty by the one person who'd stuck with him while he'd been off in the world living his dreams. She'd always wanted to be a mother. She'd said so once, he thought, anyway. And here I am. And here I am. The thought consumed him. He suddenly felt rotten inside. I'm giving her a ring that doesn't belong to her. The thought sunk in deeper. He'd been being a dog in the manger. Had he ever really wanted Laura? Or was it the idea of her all along? The image spun itself around his neck, tightening his breaths as he moved forward. Suddenly, the thought fell cold, as if the storm were rubbing off inside of him. How long had he been living a lie and forcing her to indulge by playing along? How long had she known? The thought whispered back. Tim reflected on recent arguments as he turned in his tracks. Loyalty, duty, respect. All of those were in his better nature, in his best moments. So where were they now? He started to jog, making his way back up the winding hill. This was so stupid. He had someone who'd been willing to put up with him for so many years, while he'd lived in 2 worlds, testing one with his toes while jumping into the other with both feet. How long had she known? The thought coursed through his mind. It pumped along his heartstrings, revving him up as he chewed on the realization. Suddenly, the look in her eyes made more sense. He could almost see his dad digging in the garden. And when they come around telling you their grass is greener and they're showing you a good front, ask them if you can see their closet. The thought of his dad standing in his shadows watching him made him run faster in the direction he'd come from. Just know they're really only feeding you their best foot, kiddo. Their grass ain't ever greener unless they're cheating at it. Nope, that one isn't a weed. Leave that one be, boy. They're just showing you a poker face over a hand they don't really have. Focus on your own growing, and you'll have a better view for observing from. Take it from your old man. If you knew where it was I came from, you'd know there's something better waiting for every generation coming. I'm just excited for you to see what's next, you know? You and that pretty darling of yours. She's the real thing. Whatever you do, don't forget that. Tim shook his head. His dad was a wise guy. The image of the pretty girl at the cafe entered into his mind. He couldn't picture anyone they shared their lives with finding out he'd done something stupid, and that's why the engagement was broken off. He didn't want to deal with a headache. They had been arguing lately. Most people understand a sinking ship doesn't offer much hope to its passengers. But why was it sinking? It hadn't started out that way. Or had it? He imagined a little field of underwater mines blasting at his command. A million little situations he'd kept to himself, letting them build to stand between he and the person who'd stayed, in spite of her better judgment. He watched her blast off a torpedo as he imagined the latest argument where she'd let that slip. In spite of her better judgment, he scoffed. If not for me, she wouldn't have seen the world, he told himself. The truth was they'd been fighting because she'd been saying stupid shit, and he naturally liked her less because of it. The longer they'd been together, the less she seemed to agree with him on anything. Lately, she'd been quiet in moments she might have laughed or asked him to expand on things in the past. Even then, she'd nod along and let him get things off his chest, most days. But he'd felt the distance growing. Again, he stopped, looking over his shoulder. Had he really come all this way for nothing? Maybe it was all the kismet Laura always talked about. Tim let the thought slither in, slowing his steps toward the campsite and his soon-to-be bride until they stopped completely. The thought, the idea of it, suddenly felt wrong, though he couldn't tell what part. He looked up, squinting against the raindrops. The tree line had thinned, so he could now see the clouds rolling thick above him. They glowed orange and ominous green as they passed over, capturing an eerie light from the full moon at the other side. The forest seemed less oppressive under the glow. The internal fight mode he'd been battling had died to a dull roar. Tim looked down at the gas can. Idiot. You still didn't get gasoline. Again, he looked over his shoulder at the twisted pavement disappearing in a steep S-curve. I can do it in the morning. Just say the rain got too heavy and I wanted to enjoy the trip with her. Worry about the details later. He smiled at the idea of how her face might light up, and then cringed at having to pretend for another moment that he was even the slightest bit noble. Again, the picture of the pretty stranger who'd slipped him her hotspot so he could connect to the internet at the ritzy coffee shop, who'd charged $20 to use their code for a single day. He scoffed at the idea of it. Besides, it was heroic what he was doing. He kicked another loose rock out of the way. Not hooking up with a number like that was a crime against his personal checklist. And she'd come on so strong, making gestures he'd only seen on the internet, never in real life. She was bold. He watched her disappearing behind the aisle of chips and junk food. He picked up his feet again. She reminded him a lot of Laura when he'd first met her. A chill ran down his spine. She hadn't always been quiet. Not back then, anyway. He remembered watching her proudly climbing a fire escape at the base of the tallest building in his hometown. She'd turned to invite him to climb along after reaching the first landing, and had already dove over the building's upper ledge before he gave up the view to follow after as fast as he could. Tim frowned again. When had she gone quiet? And how had he not noticed the progression? The answer was simple enough. He hadn't really been paying attention. You wanted this. The thought slithered in with the smiling cafe girl. Her eyes sparkled with the same light he still caught glimpses of in his fiancée when she didn't think anyone was looking. He'd caught her dancing around the kitchen from time to time, grinning with her eyes shut. He'd stopped asking what she was thinking about, but he still loved soaking in these moments. Tim swung the gas can into a stray bush as he imagined what she'd be doing if he came back and surprised her before she'd expected him. Then again, he'd been gone for a while, so maybe she was already long past the time of expectation and well into the annoyance he'd found lurking behind every corner, until recently anyway. She had seemed happier since he'd popped the question. He was coming around a bend in the road. The final stretch leading to their campsite entrance had come into view when his phone dinged, stopping him in his tracks. It was the first time the notification had sounded since he'd hurried to step away from the campsite. And right after he'd left, it disappeared. He opened his phone screen. Connect to AAA hotspot. The option prompted. Tim hesitated again. He looked both ways as he stood dumbfounded at the fork in the road. Thankfully, the rain had mostly let up, but the wind still howled, and the thunder still sounded through the opening in the canopy above him. The steady gusts were cold against his wet clothes. His finger hovered over acceptance before descending down. What could it hurt to accept, right? It's not like he was planning to go through with anything anymore, but at least he'd have ammunition during his next lay, something to fire him up whenever he felt like it. After a moment, his dim phone screen brightened to show him he was now connected, though the signal was weak. As he was getting ready to put his phone down and continue walking, a text bubble popped up. The picture was the same one from the profile that had been resting under his lock screen since that morning. You chicken out or what? I've been waiting forever. ... Tim smiled, imagining the avatar laughing at him playfully from behind the message. His thumbs remained frozen, poised above the phone screen, as he tried to think of something clever to respond with. You didn't get lost, did you? ? The text box prompted again. He turned uphill to follow the fork leading back to his tent. Maybe it would be better to let this heat up slow, see where it goes, he reassured himself as he typed out his reply. No, sorry, got tied up, can't make it tonight. Send. Rain check? ? Send. The 3 dots of destiny appeared, stopping him in his tracks as he waited with bated breath for the stranger's response. Want something to remember me by until then? ? Tim's heartbeat quickened. Yes. Send. You have to send me something first. It's only fair. I'll show you mine if you'll show me yours. ... He smiled. Sounded exactly like something Laura would have said in the beginning. He let the smile fade from his face. Tim looked up and in the direction of their campsite, biting his lip before dodging behind a tree line to take a provocative selfie, worthy of an exchange. It was just a picture, after all. A camera flashed out of view, and Tim returned to the barely paved road, readjusting his pants. He held up his phone, peering at the screen for a moment as he fumbled with his belt, before again hitting send. Now it's your turn, ... Smiley face. His heart sank with every second the dots signaling response didn't appear. He waited, and he waited, and he waited just above the fork in the road until he realized the time. Tim started to trot as the rain picked up speed again, falling in with the wind pushing against him. After a little ways, he stopped to check the hot spot and see if it was still active. It appeared stronger than it had at first. He could see the first campsite. Its fire glowed in the background of the trees standing between he and its occupants. He could hear its embers crackling under the drizzle of rain attacking it. Tim was sizing up the group sitting around its outer edge when his phone lit up again. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed to the other side of the active campsite, going as fast as his feet would carry him. When he was out of their sight, he opened his phone and saw something completely different than what he'd expected. A notification for a new picture on Laura's Insta story. Tim frowned and swiped past it. He moved back to the message log. The dots of destiny rose and fell. They danced and then disappeared. He closed his phone screen again, and just as it was going back into his pocket, it buzzed. New message, the lock screen proclaimed. Tim swiped and typed his password. His excitement rose as he realized the hot spot was growing stronger. He looked behind at the distance he'd covered. The road was still dark and empty. He opened the message, and in a single second, his expression flipped 180 degrees. His eyes opened wide, horrified at what he was seeing. The last chapter of his life flashed before him. A picture and a single word had changed everything. He slowly swiped his finger over the screen, switching over to see Laura's Insta story. The same picture popped up. His fiancée, laughing happily with her eyes closed while squeezing into his new fantasy. The girl from the cafe, who was glaring directly into the camera with a look meant for one person, and one person only. His eyes strayed to the engagement ring on Laura's finger, highlighted with the caption reading, "Here to celebrate the newest addition to the family. Only thing missing, ... is you!" ! Another note was in parentheses, smaller. As you can see, nothing has changed. Winking smiley face. #sisters forever. Heart emoji. Timothy's phone clattered to the ground, revealing the message box once more. The picture that said 1,000 words. And the single word, busted, ... burned into his mind. His mouth hung open, dumbfounded yet again, as a new message sank in. "Houston, we have a problem," it read. The dots appeared again to launch the final missile, blasting through the screen to glow menacingly at him from the wet pavement. The words burned into his mind. "You failed. Tim didn't move. He stood, staring, without making a move. What a strange day it had been. To be continued. Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in to The Honeymooners. This one kind of came to me out of the blue. I had to get it off my chest, so I am looking forward to your feedback, and I hope you all love it. As always, thank you for tuning in.